God that He's on the throne. He's not coming off the throne. He is going to reign. It's good to be in the house of God. Tell somebody close to you you're glad to see Him. See Him in the house of the Lord today. Bless you. Let me explain technology to you. Technology is great until it doesn't work. I'd say that for this reason. Last Sunday, one of the computers updated, and suddenly all the projection software stopped working. And the software company wanted $1,000 to get it working right, which I screamed at them enough that they lowered their price some. So last night, when the same computer suggested that it needed an update, Brother Tommy didn't update it. Makes sense until the lights don't work this morning. That's technology. It'll drive you crazy. You can be seated today. God bless you for being at the house of God. I want to start today with establishing some focus for the sanctuary for this year. Before I do that, I just want to give you some quick updates. It's funny how sickness hits all at once. And there are multiple families not with us today because they're in the hospital. The good thing is everybody that's been in the hospital this past few days have gotten great reports, and we're thankful for that. But between Wednesday and Friday, I was in 5 different hospitals in 5 different cities. And that's just the way it goes. It's just kind of been crazy. And I didn't get to everybody that I needed to. As a matter of fact, I wasn't able to visit everyone that I wanted to visit who were in the hospital. That's just it just comes in spurts. It seems like. You got a text this morning about the Christmas for Christ offering. If you made a commitment to that a few weeks ago, we need you to meet that commitment by this Wednesday. If you didn't make a commitment, it is something that we work very hard to send a very good offering to. It is that money is used to plant new churches all across North America, Canada, the U.S., and it is vital that we continue to plant new churches. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Christian churches are closing at a much greater pace than we are planting new ones. The reality is that so many times it's Christian churches that have been around a long, long, long time that get themselves into a rut and cannot get past their tradition, and they shut out younger folks, younger families, because if you're not going to sing our old songs and do things our old ways, then we don't want you here, and that is the death spiral for a church, and it's happening everywhere you turn. And those churches, we don't need to replace them. We need to be planting more than are closing. So that's what that offering is about, if you wonder, and it is very much worth your hard-earned coin. February the 14th is Valentine's Day. How many of you guys remembered that? If you didn't, it's okay. Between now and then, your wife will remind you if you didn't. But on Valentine's Day, it happens to fall on a Wednesday, and we need to do a church business meeting. And I'm well aware that it's Valentine's Day, but I'm also well aware that most of you don't celebrate Valentine's Day until Friday or Saturday. So it's rather unusual for folks to be celebrating Valentine's Day during the middle of the week. So we need to have our annual business meeting. It will be operated according to Robert's Rules of Orders, and strictly so. So I want to give you an opportunity. Throw that slide up for me right quick about the business meeting. If you feel like there's something that you would like to have discussed, you can send a text to that number. You can send an email to that email address. We will get those, and we'll discuss those with the trustees. It has to be something that is legitimate to the business meeting of the church. So if you want to discuss Nickelodeon, we probably will skip that. But we want to give you an opportunity to get something into the agenda, because once the agenda is set, it will be. All right, I think I'm done with all of that. My wife taught about fasting in the first session. If you missed it, I will guarantee you missed some great teaching, because I've been hearing it all week. And I knew that she had some revelation to share with you. You can move from that slide now. But I want us to embark on 30 days. We're starting off this new year. I realize that we're already through January. But if you didn't notice, the weather made it kind of difficult to start much of anything. And that's January in Indiana. But I want to embark on 30 days of fasting for this church. I'm not going to dictate when you start your 30 days. I'd like for it to be soon. I'm not going to dictate to you how you fast. There's lots of ways to fast. For some, food is the ultimate fast. It's not really so much for me. Food is fuel in most cases. I'm not a foodie. But I would like for you to take a couple days, figure out what you want to fast, and then it takes some preparation to actually do it if you're going to stick with it. So figure out what you want to fast. For some, social media is worse than fasting food. And as an introvert, I find that incredibly baffling. But because social media just frustrates me. For some, fasting the TV screen is worse than fasting water or whatever you like to drink. So what I want you to do is fast in such a way that it absolutely challenges you to make a change in your life. And my goal is not to get through 30 days of fasting. My goal is to get spiritual disciplines of this nature started in your life, and they need to last. So through the course of these 30 days, I want you also to be praying and figuring out how that you can have one day per week of fasting. And that one probably does need to be food related. But every week. Because we have to discipline this flesh. Because there is a war between the spirit and the flesh that never shuts down. And the only way that some things are conquered in your life are through prayer and fasting. And so I challenge you to do that. The goal of fasting is to become more sensitive to God's voice and God's presence. You won't change God's mind. In most cases, better change that. God doesn't need his mind changed. We need ours changed. God doesn't need to see better. We need to see better. So fasting accomplishes us entering into more unity and harmony with the Lord. And what I want to see this church do is establish better spiritual disciplines in our lives. So turn your Bibles to the 10th chapter of the book of Luke. You don't have to stand, though. I'm just giving you a heads up. I'll get there in a minute. I'm not going to do a typical altar call at the end of my message today. I want to do what I would just call a unity call. I want to challenge us as a church to see things in a different light than maybe we ever have. So I'm going to challenge you today, and I realize that not everybody can. But if you can, we're going to step into this altar today as a church, as a unified body. We're going to pray together, make some commitments together. I don't know that you necessarily would see it like this unless you just change the way that you look at things. But the reality is they mugged him. Probably haven't really noticed that in that light in the Bible, and that's okay. But it's a pretty cut and dry, pure and simple situation. They mugged him, beat him within an inch of his life, threw him in a ditch. It's really not a complicated event to understand. Under the circumstances, not even surprising. Muggings had been happening since close to when God put mankind on terra firma. The account states that they stripped him of his clothes, his belongings, and left him wounded and helpless in a ditch on the side of the road to die. Helpless. And what I want you to see is that he was the man in the ditch. To those that passed by and happened to see him, he's the guy in the ditch. I was walking down the road today and I saw this guy just in the ditch, bleeding. Didn't seem like he was able to get out, as a matter of fact. I didn't stop to help, though. Just thought I'd tell you the story. It appears that this fellow was traveling down a road that was well known for muggings. Well known as a place where these things happened. Matter of fact, it was somewhat understood that you don't go down that road alone. You didn't travel this road without some sort of protective force. You went in numbers and you made sure that somebody knew how to fight before you decided to go down this road. It was that dangerous and it was well known. Formerly, history has called it the Jaco Road. It's a 17-mile stretch that connected Jerusalem to Jericho. It is not your typical artery that might connect two bustling communities. It snaked its way through the mountains heading east out of Jerusalem. The Jericho Road was filled with treacherous cliffs. It was cut out of the rocky mountainside. You encountered sharp turns, canyons, craggy mountain passes, places that made it easy for a bandit to hide. To add to the dangers just of the road itself, the difference in altitude between Jerusalem and Jericho was 3,600 feet. Over a 17-mile stretch, that's a pretty big drop. This was not just a mountain road. This was a mountain road leading down at a pretty steep angle. Climbing it back up would have been even worse. And all of that mountainous terrain created wonderful spots for a bandit to hide. And there were groups of them who literally made their living from robbing the unsuspecting and the unwise, who just might be found alone on the Jericho road. It was so dangerous that in ancient times it earned the moniker the Bloody Road, because people were mugged on it often, even daily. History records that all the way into the 19th century, it was understood if you lived in that area, you did not travel the Jericho road without paying protection money to whoever the local sheik was. And if you didn't pay for protection, they would exact it out of your flesh and your belongings that might have been with you on that road. And it seems that everyone understood you don't travel the bloody road alone, or your blood will be mingled with those that came before you, that gave it that reputation. You don't travel this road alone, or you will be the man in the ditch. When you understand the history behind the Jericho road, you begin to gain insight why in the 10th chapter of Luke's gospel that you hear Jesus use that road as the setting for maybe the most famous object lesson that ever has been shared. It begins in the 25th verse of the 10th chapter of Luke. It begins with an arrogant man. The Bible says, and behold, a certain lawyer. I just want to clarify. This was a scholar of the Mosaic law, not an attorney. That was for you, Jake. He stood up and tested Jesus. He wanted to see if he could make a fool out of the Lord. And so he asked a question that everyone knew the answer to right then. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And the Lord responded, what's written in the law? What's your reading of it? Well, we've been taught all of our lives that you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. The Lord responded to him, you've answered well. Do this and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, decided he'd ask another question. And you can just almost hear the snarkiness of his voice. And just who is my neighbor? I've heard this all my life, but who's my neighbor, Lord? Who are you really talking about? And Jesus answered with a parable. It begins with verse 30. He said, well, a certain man, and there's your answer. I'll get to it more in a minute. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing. Study the Greek a little deeper and you'll understand that the indication is not just that he was stripped of his clothing. They stole everything he had. Wounded him, departed leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. As if I stay on this side, maybe it won't matter that I saw him. Maybe I'll forget that I saw him if I stay over here. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked. He crossed the road to where the man in the ditch was and gawked down at him. He looked at him, crossed back to the other side, continued his merry way. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I come again, I'll repay you." So which of these 3, Jesus asks, do you think was neighbor to him who fell among thieves? The response, well, he who showed him mercy. And then Jesus said, correct, now you go do the same thing. Who's my neighbor? Most people call this story the parable of the Good Samaritan. And they focus on the kindness and the compassion of the man who rescued the one who was in the ditch. Surely it's a good lesson to learn. Surely it's something that we should pay attention to and should mimic. But there are some details, there are some nuances in this story that there are obviously intentional, yet we don't really pay much attention to them. And I don't want to minimize the message of Jesus. I don't want to minimize the importance of the Good Samaritan. But I want to bring some focus to something that I don't know that we always see. For the next 3 weeks at the sanctuary, I want to focus on the man in the ditch. Because maybe this parable doesn't need to be about the Good Samaritan near as much as it needs to be about the man in the ditch. We talk and talk and talk about the Good Samaritan, but we don't really talk much about the man in the ditch. We don't know a whole lot about the man in the ditch, but there are some things that we can tell quickly about the man in the ditch. We can tell quickly that he shouldn't have been in the ditch. We can tell quickly that common sense would have told him you don't need to be on the bloody road all by yourself. But then common sense seems to be a little in short supply in the culture that we live in today, at least from a biblical perspective. So I want to ask a few questions that I think will shed some light. First question I want to ask is, who was the man in the ditch? Who is this guy that Jesus puts the spotlight on? Jesus listened to the answer from the scholar and tells him, You've got this right. You have described good priorities. And then the snarky question number 2, well, who is my neighbor? Then Jesus begins to show. He shows how the priest and the Levite were not neighborly. Then he tells of the Samaritan that came along, and he proved himself to be a neighbor to the man in the ditch. But I don't know if you've ever noticed this. Jesus does not give a direct answer to the question, who is my neighbor? He just told a story, and the story provides the answer, but Jesus didn't give a direct answer. And the word neighbor, when you dig into it in the original Greek from which this translation came to us, it's not really the way that we use it. Neighbor in the Greek really distilled down to person who is close to you. I don't mean close relationship. I mean the person that is in close proximity to you. Human being that is close enough to you that you can see them, that you can speak to them, that you might be able to touch them. That's what neighbor meant in this context. The person who was right there. Today we talk about a neighbor, and it's the person that we live close to. They live in our neighborhood. They live right next door. But in Jesus' use here, it was anybody that was close enough in the moment. They were your neighbor. That's why he begins the story of the Good Samaritan, so-called, a certain man. And what the priest and the Levite didn't want to really deal with was the fact that when they walked close enough to see the man in the ditch, he became their neighbor in that instant. That's my neighbor in the ditch. Why? Because he is a human being and he is close enough to me that I can see him, speak to him, interact with him, help him if that's what is needed. So when this arrogant religious scholar asked Jesus, "Who's my neighbor?" the ultimate answer to it is easily understood, that the man in the ditch was the neighbor. He was neighbor to the priest because he was close enough to see him. He was neighbor to the Levite. He actually crossed the road and looked down at him. It's an interesting tangent question that could be asked right here. Why'd the Levite cross the road? So he could stare down at the man in the ditch and then walk back to the other side and keep on going. The man in the ditch was a neighbor to the Samaritan. And the Samaritan actually treated him as a neighbor should. Love your neighbor as yourself. Neighbor's a two-way street. If I'm close enough to the man in the ditch that he qualifies as my neighbor, then I also qualify as the neighbor of the man in the ditch. And the responsibility of having a neighbor runs both directions. And if the day arrives when it's me in the ditch, I hope the neighbor that shows up will reach down and pull me out of the ditch rather than cross the road, wave at me and smile and say, "How'd you get in that ditch?" and then walk on away while I'm bleeding out my life lying in the ditch. Scholar, who's my neighbor? Everyone around you all the time is your neighbor. So what's the ditch? This is a parable. It didn't actually happen. This is a story that Jesus used as an object lesson. So everything is imagery. Everything means something. Everything has a point. What's the ditch? I'll tell you what the ditch is. The ditch is a trap for the wounded. The ditch is a trap for the damaged. It's a trap for those who are weak in this moment. It's a trap for those, and so many are convinced that they'll never get out of the ditch, that they'll never be able to ever escape from it. I'm too wounded, I'm too damaged, I'm too trapped, I'm too stuck, I'm never going to get past this, I'm never going to get around this. When what they need is not another self-help program, they need a neighbor. That's what they need. They need a neighbor, somebody that shows up and says, "I will love you until we get you out of the ditch. I will help you until we get you out of the ditch. I will do what it takes so that I can help you get out of the ditch." That ditch is it is some place where people are trapped by sin, and they're trapped by their mistakes, and they're trapped by their choices. They're trapped by the woundedness of their hearts and wounded spirits. They're trapped trapped by the way that others have treated them, or they're trapped by the extent of their confusion. And if there is a characteristic that represents this day, it is confusion. I don't want to be insensitive to those who are sincere. But the reason there are so many who can't figure out the difference between a man and a lady is not biology. It is confusion. It's a trap. It has some folks so convinced of what they believe that it has become a trap to hold them hostage in a ditch that's going to destroy them. Now let me get to my message. What I want to ask today is why. What I want to ask next week is what. And what I want to ask the third week is how. Why? Why was the man in the ditch? Now that we understand a little bit about the man, why was he in the ditch? The answer is he'd been attacked. He had been mugged. It wasn't enough just to steal his stuff. They beat him, the Bible says, until he was half dead. It wasn't enough just to take the things from him. You can aim a gun and somebody will give you their wallet, but after they give you their wallet, is there any really reason for you to shoot them? But so many just go ahead and pull the trigger anyway. They had his stuff. They had him overpowered. Why? See, he hadn't just been attacked and stolen from. He'd been wounded, injured. He was in the ditch because he was unable to get out. See, I think that's something that we don't really focus in on. Why? Why is he in the ditch? Well, because they attacked him. Correct. I get that. But let's take it a step further. Why didn't he crawl out? Because he couldn't. Why are there so many people in the world that we live in stuck in the ditch? Why are there so many people in situations in their lives right now where you look at them and you think, why in the world are you in that? And we want to look at so many people so many times and say, well, you just need to come out. The reason so many are in the ditch is because they lack the ability to do that. And yet, the Levite walks by, looks at him, and just seems to assume, well, he'll get out when he's ready, I guess. The priest walked by and didn't even care enough to think about it. The Samaritan came by, looked down, and began to realize, wait a minute, he's not even making an attempt. Something's going on here. There must be a reason why he's still in the ditch. There was. He lacked the ability to get out. I tell you today, we have got to look at the world we live in differently. We have got to somehow stop looking around and saying, well, you can get out of that confusion if you just read the right book. It may be deeper than that. It may be you want to look at him and say, well, you can get out of that ditch if you would just do this or do that. Have we stopped to consider for a moment that life may have wounded people so very much that they look at it and say, I just can't get out. I wish I could. Let me say it like this. The priest's neighbor was in the ditch because he couldn't get out. The Levite's neighbor was in the ditch because he couldn't get out. Brother Church Guy's neighbor was in the ditch because he couldn't get out. Sister Church Lady's neighbor was in the ditch because they couldn't get out. And how many times and how long sometimes have we looked at people in ditches around us and said, my goodness gracious, if you would just quit doing that, or if you would just change this, or if you would just change that. And we're the Levite walking by saying, you know what? I think you can get out by yourself. You don't need me. I'm going to move on along. And they're in the ditch because they can't get out. Who's my neighbor? That guy in the ditch. He's too wounded to escape. Too wounded to even realize the danger that he's in. Too wounded to realize that he's dying. Or maybe he's too confused to realize how confused he is. Here's another question for you. Why was he on the Jericho road alone? This is not accident, folks. Jesus drew this picture. And he painted it carefully. It's not like God's going to make a mistake. God, you screwed that one up. You should have give us some more detail. He knew exactly what he was saying. Why was this dude on the Jericho road, the bloody road, all by himself? One of the most dangerous scenarios that Jesus could have put him in is what he chose. And how many times have you watched someone making life choices knowing you are headed off down a bloody road? How many times have you watched people doing things that you knew weren't going to turn out well? I wonder if somebody told this gentleman, hey, that's the Jericho road. You need to wait on a caravan. You don't need to try to traverse that by yourself. You don't want to be on that road all alone. But if you'll wait until there's a crowd going, then there's strength and there's safety in numbers. And so don't do that all by yourself. Tomorrow there's a caravan going if you'll just wait. But instead, it appears that this man just set off down the Jericho road from Jerusalem to Jericho on his own. And we don't know how far he got down there. We don't know. Jesus said he set off going down to Jericho. But somewhere along the way, he got stopped. He wound up. And my neighbor wound up in the ditch. I can't figure out why in the world people do some things sometimes. I don't have an answer for you today of why was he on the Jericho road alone. I don't have an answer of why addicts are addicts. Oh, I know, you can give the snarky little remark. Well, you know, they shot up with something. They took something and made them an addict. Well, thanks, genius. Something drove them to the road. Something ushered them to the bloody road that so many other had already traversed. Because I want to tell you something. The Levite could walk by the guy in the ditch because he wasn't the first guy he'd seen in the ditch. The priest could walk by the guy in the ditch because it wasn't the first time he had seen it. This was the bloody road. It happened all the time. You don't go down this road by yourself, or you'll be the man in the ditch. You'll be the one all by yourself out there, as the old standard said, oozing life, lying in the ditch. This wasn't the first time. This was common, and it's common still today. I don't know why people head off down the Jericho road where there only lies death ahead for them, but I see it all the time. And I want you to know there's a bigger reason than they just made a decision. There's a bigger reason than they just decided to do it. There's something that drives people over the cliff. There's something that drives people toward the Jericho road when they know the danger, when they know it's bad, when they know it probably won't end well. And yet they go anyway. Can I tell you something? The answer he was on the Jericho road alone is immaterial. It doesn't matter. I'm a why kind of person. I like the why. I like to ask why. I want to know why. I've always been that way. I hated mathematics until I discovered physics, which is the study of why. Suddenly math was fun, because it was helping me answer the question of why. And I loved it, and I learned very quickly all kinds of things that I had never picked up in algebra class. I learned in physics, and things I couldn't understand in geometry, I learned in physics, because I want to know why. It's just natural built into me. I love to know why. There's a lot of people like me, but I have to sometimes shut off this desire to know why and say, wait a minute, it doesn't matter in this case. Why is not important. What needs to be answered is what needs to happen now. And that's next week. I'll never understand probably why some people make some choices that they've made. And you want to ask them, why in the world are you doing that? Why do that to yourself? Why do that to your family? But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter why. The question that we really need to ask about the man in the ditch is, why does it matter to me? Why should I be concerned about the man in the ditch? Because he's your neighbor. And Jesus told us to love our neighbor as ourselves. He gave us a mission. We call it a great commission. And if you truly want to love your neighbor, the way that we will love our neighbor the most beautifully is to somehow lead them to an altar of repentance. Show them the love of God that reaches a hand down into the ditch and says, I don't judge you because you're in the ditch. I don't need to know why you're in the ditch. I don't necessarily need to know how and what led to this. I don't want to ridicule you by telling you about your choices that were bad, because it'd be easy to point at you and say, if you hadn't done that stupid, you wouldn't be in this situation. But that's not going to help the guy in the ditch. He doesn't need to be told all of his problems. He needs a hand that'll be reaching down to him and say, we'll worry about the rest in a little while, but let me love you out of the ditch. That's why it matters, because Jesus came and said, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor when he's in the ditch. Love him when he's next door. Love him when you see him on the street. Love him when you encounter them at Walmart. But if you find them in the ditch, love them there too. You can't just walk by on the other side. You can't wave down at them and tell them, you just made a bunch of bad choices. I'll let you figure this out by yourself. Why does it matter? Why does it matter to me? Why does it matter to the sanctuary? Because Jesus told us to love the man in the ditch. He's my mission. The man in the ditch is part of why the Lord filled me with his Spirit. The man in the ditch is somebody that Jesus shed his blood for just as much as for me. Love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Whoever's close. They may not be close tomorrow, but if they're close enough right now, they're your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Whoever's close. Whichever human being, whichever child of God that he created. I am convinced that we have missed the point so many times about this, or missed a point about this man in the ditch. He is my neighbor. He's not just some guy. He's not just somebody that I encountered. He is my neighbor, and I have been told to love him as myself. And I'm telling you right now, if I ever get knocked in the ditch and I have the capacity to pull myself out of the ditch, I'm going to love myself enough to get out of the ditch. But I hope to goodness that if I lack the capacity to get myself out, that somebody will show up and be my neighbor. Pull me out. Rescue me. Because I'm called to love the man in the ditch as much as I love myself. Would you stand with me? I'm done. I told you at the beginning, our closing time today would be a time to step into the altar as a church. And if you're here, you're our guest, you're welcome to join us. I don't want to exclude anybody. You're not joining the church by stepping down to have a moment of prayer. But we got to unify around the vision of who the neighbor is. Jesus' statement that the Samaritan had compassion on the man in the ditch is also a statement that the priest and the Levite had no compassion. Human nature is like this. Human flesh, human skin is like this. We develop something called calluses. A person who works with their hands a lot develops calluses on their hands. A person who walks and walks and walks and walks develops calluses on their feet. But then the person whose eyes witness all of the hurt and all of the struggle and all of the damaged people develop calluses on our eyes and on our hearts to where we can walk past one in the ditch, look at them and say, you probably deserve to be where you're at. I'll just let you figure it out. You got there all by yourself. I'm going to tell you something. If you can look around at your fellow man without feeling some spiritual hurt for them, it's time that we get the calluses off of our heart. 2024 for the sanctuary needs to be a year where we start doing our best to get the calluses off so that we can recognize who my neighbor is. He's the man in the ditch. God, I want you to make me more sensitive than I've ever been to the needs of others. I want you to help me, Lord, not to judge the one that I find in the ditch. I want you to help me not to be the explainer to them. Well, you got here because of this, and this. And I got to tell you, I am that guy. I have to shut that down all the time because I'm always trying to ascertain the why. And when you figure out the why, there's some crazy, sinister thing about human nature that says, I need to explain this to you. I'm going to tell you something. The guy in the ditch doesn't need an explainer. He just needs somebody who will love him out of the ditch. He just needs somebody who says, why doesn't matter. But if you want out, I'll help you out. Why doesn't matter, but I just want you to know I love you. I love you enough to reach out. I'll stop today. I'll put my agenda aside for a moment. I'll put the schedule on hold for just long. Can I help you get out of that ditch? If you don't get out of the ditch, you're going to die. Who are you? I'm your neighbor. And the Lord called me to love you out of the ditch. I'm your neighbor. Can you pray with me for a second? God, I want you to help us. We desperately need you to help us to become more sensitive. And Lord, I pray as a church, as we embark on a fast these next few days, and that fast challenges us, I pray that as we draw closer to you, that the sensitivity in our spirit to your spirit would become heightened more so than ever before, and that we'll hear your voice better than we've heard it, and we'll respond to your leading better than we have, and that we will see the world in a different light, and the man in the ditch will not just be the guy who made a bunch of bad choices, but the man in the ditch will be the guy that I'm called to help out of the ditch. I don't care how you got here, sir. Young lady, I don't care how you got into the ditch. I'm sorry you're there. I just want to help you out. I just want you to know I love you enough. I'll help you. Let me put my world on hold for a minute while I help you out of the ditch. If you want to come out, there's somebody who will help you out. There's a way out. And it doesn't have to be that you're strong enough. It may be that I'm strong enough to help you out. And so here I come. So sanctuary, could we just fill this altar today? Just take a moment. You can kneel, you can stand. I'm not concerned about what you do here, other than to pray and to begin to pray, God, please help me to become more sensitive. Help me, Lord, to see through the right lens. Help me to understand what I haven't understood. Help me to see things more accurately. Come on, church. This isn't